This is a work of fiction created for entertainment purposes. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you are watching from. It is always fascinating to see how far these stories can reach. The winter of 1801 in Albemarle County, Virginia, was recorded as one of the coldest in living memory. The Rivanna River froze solid for the first time in 17 years, and the dirt roads leading to the county seat became impassable for weeks at a time. Snow accumulated to depths that prevented travel between settlements, and families found themselves isolated on their properties for extended periods. But for those who lived near the Caldwell estate, approximately 8 miles northwest of Charlottesville, along what was then called the Mountain Road, the cold was not the only thing that made them reluctant to venture out after dark. The Caldwell family had established their presence in Virginia in 1762, when Cornelius Caldwell, a merchant from Philadelphia, acquired nearly 2,000 acres of land through a combination of purchase and land grants obtained through connections with the colonial administration. The estate, known locally as Caldwell Heights due to its elevated position overlooking the Rivanna Valley, consisted of the main house, several outbuildings, tobacco-curing barns, a mill structure, and extensive fields worked by a substantial labor force. By 1801, the family was in its third generation of Virginia residency, and Cornelius's grandson, Silas Caldwell, managed the property with the same meticulous attention to detail and reputation for severity that had characterized his grandfather's business dealings. Municipal records from the period describe Silas as a man of 47 years, married to his second wife, Parthenia, after the death of his first wife during an outbreak of influenza in 1795. The couple had no surviving issue, though Parthenia had given birth to 2 infants, both of whom perished within days of their arrival into the world. Silas had 3 adult offspring from his first marriage, sons named Devereux, aged 26, and Gideon, aged 23, and a daughter, Sophronia, who had married a merchant from Richmond in 1788 and established her own household in that city. The main house at Caldwell Heights was constructed in the Georgian style, popular among Virginia gentry of the period. According to architectural surveys conducted in the 1920s by the Virginia Historical Society, before the last remnants of the foundation were removed, the structure featured brick construction imported from England, symmetric facade with 5 bays across, central hallway with rooms distributed evenly on either side, and, notably, an unusually large cellar that extended beyond the footprint of the house itself. This cellar, according to local accounts collected much later, was where Cornelius Caldwell had stored merchandise during his trading days, including imported goods that may not have been properly declared to customs authorities, and various items acquired through means that were not discussed in polite company. The cellar was accessed through an external entrance on the north side of the house, with stone steps descending approximately 10 feet below ground level. A second access point existed through a trapdoor in the main hall, though this interior entrance was reportedly kept locked and sealed with wax during Silas Caldwell's tenure as master of the estate. The reasoning behind this sealing was never officially documented. In January of 1801, something occurred at Caldwell Heights that would not be fully documented until many years after the fact. The official county records from that period are remarkably sparse concerning the Caldwell family. Birth and death entries continue normally for other families in the district, recording the usual patterns of mortality and addition. Marriage bonds, property transfers, and tax assessments appear with expected regularity for neighboring estates. But for the Caldwells, there is an inexplicable gap between November 1800 and April 1801, as though the family had simply ceased to exist for those 5 months. This gap was first noted by a county clerk named Hosea Whitfield in 1837, when he was organizing old records for transfer to a new courthouse following the previous building's destruction by fire. In a notation preserved in the margins of the record book, Whitfield wrote, Considerable absence of entries concerning the Caldwell estate during winter months 1800-1801. Upon inquiry was informed by elder residents that family remained isolated during that period due to illness, though no medical records confirm this, and the attending physician allegedly present cannot be traced in any contemporary documentation. The subsequent entries, beginning in April, show alterations in several hands, suggesting documents were prepared retrospectively rather than contemporaneously. Paper stock differs from surrounding pages. Ink shows no aging consistent with documents of equivalent date. What Whitfield had discovered was that several pages of the county register had been carefully removed and replaced. The replacement pages contained entries dated to the missing period, but the paper stock was different from the standard foolscap used by the county clerk's office in 1801. The ink showed no aging, no fading, no foxing that would be expected in documents exposed to 36 years of storage in less than ideal conditions. Most tellingly, the handwriting, while attempting to match the original clerk's distinctive style, displayed subtle variations that suggested a different author, someone who had access to examples of the clerk's hand, but could not perfectly replicate the pressure patterns and letter formations that constitute an individual's unique script. A more detailed account of the situation emerged in 1852, when a former overseer of the Caldwell estate, a man named Josiah Merrick, provided testimony during an unrelated land dispute involving property boundaries adjacent to what had been the Caldwell holdings. Merrick, who was in his 70s at the time and in failing health, mentioned in passing that he had witnessed what he called the alteration of records in the spring of 1801. When pressed by the attorney conducting the deposition to explain this reference, Merrick became visibly agitated, according to the court reporter's observations noted in the margin of the transcript. After a lengthy pause, he stated only that certain things that transpired that winter were deemed unsuitable for permanent record, and that persons of influence saw to it that the official account reflected what was necessary for civil order, not what was true to actual events. The attorney attempted to pursue this line of questioning further, but Merrick refused to elaborate, citing his advanced age and declining memory. He did, however, make one additional statement before the matter was dropped. I was present when the new pages were prepared. 4 men of standing came to the clerk's office. I had been summoned to provide testimony regarding dates of certain events. They questioned me closely, then dismissed me. Through the door, I heard them discussing which version of events would be recorded. The clerk himself was not present. They were writing the records themselves. Merrick died 3 weeks after giving this testimony, his death attributed to complications from pneumonia. The transcript of his statement was filed with other documents related to the land case, where it remained unnoticed until 1963, when historian Lavinia Pritchard discovered it during research into antebellum Virginia court records. The physical evidence of what occurred during that winter of 1800-1801 was even more fragmentary than the documentary record. The Caldwell estate itself burned to the ground in 1843 under circumstances that were never satisfactorily explained to the satisfaction of insurance investigators. The fire occurred on a night in August with no lightning activity recorded at nearby weather observation points and no known ignition sources within the vacant structure. The house had been unoccupied for several months at that point. Yet by morning nothing remained but the brick chimneys, the foundation stones, and the stone-lined cellar, which had partially collapsed inward due to the heat. Local accounts from the time, preserved in letters and diary entries of neighboring families, mentioned that the fire was visible for miles, burning with unusual intensity through the night. One witness, Ephraim Coulter, wrote to his brother, "The Caldwell place burned last night with a fierceness I have never witnessed in timber fires. The flames seemed to consume the structure from within, and there was a smell carried on the wind that was not merely burning wood, but something else I cannot properly describe, like metal heated beyond its melting point, or earth torn from deep beneath the surface. The cellar, which might have contained items preserved from the earlier period, was filled with rubble and subsequently sealed when the property was sold to new owners who built a more modest farmhouse on a different portion of the land, well away from the original house site. The reason for choosing a different building location was not recorded in the sale documents, but was noted in a letter from the new owner, Nathaniel Wharton, to his father in Maryland. The original house site feels wrong in a way I cannot articulate. The ground there seems different, heavier somehow. We will build elsewhere. However, certain documents did survive the general loss of Caldwell family records. In 1897, during the demolition of an old dependency building that had once been part of the Caldwell Estate's kitchen complex, workers discovered a leather-bound ledger wedged between floor joists in a space that appeared to have been deliberately concealed. The ledger, which had been wrapped in oilcloth for protection, appeared to be a household accounts book, covered the period from August 1800 through March 1801. The entries were in a feminine hand, presumably that of Parthenia Caldwell, and documented routine domestic matters, purchases of candles, flour, and fabric, notes about preserving vegetables for winter consumption, reminders about servants' tasks, records of visitors received and social obligations fulfilled. The early entries present a picture of normal domestic life for a family of their station. There are notations about fabric ordered from Richmond for new curtains, instructions for the preparation of fruit preserves, recordings of small expenditures for household items. Parthenia's handwriting in these early entries is neat, controlled, and consistent, but beginning in late December 1800, the character of the entries changed in ways that suggest growing unease. The handwriting became less regular, with letters formed more hastily and lines that wandered on the page. The content shifted from mundane household matters to observations that suggested something was disturbing the normal patterns of life at Caldwell Heights. An entry dated December 28, 1800 reads, "The young men have taken to remaining in the upper rooms past customary hours. They descend only for meals and speak in lowered voices when they believe themselves unobserved. S. insists there is nothing amiss, but I note his own countenance has grown drawn, with dark circles beneath his eyes suggesting insufficient rest. The servants speak among themselves in whispers that cease abruptly when I approach. When I inquired of Hester what troubled them, she would say only that certain sounds have been heard during night hours, though she would not specify their nature." On January 3, 1801, woke before dawn to sounds from below, from the direction of the cellar. S. explained it was merely the house settling in the cold, timbers contracting in the frost. But houses do not settle in patterns of 3 strikes. Then silence of perhaps 30 seconds. Then 3 strikes again, continuing in this rhythm. I have ceased sleeping soundly. The pattern is too regular to be natural settlement. January 9th. The eldest, D.Ed, came to me today with a question I could not answer. He asked why the cellar door, the external entrance, must remain bolted from outside with 3 separate locks, when there is no one confined within, and no goods stored there requiring such security. I had no ready explanation, for I had not known it was bolted at all, much less with such elaborate measures. When I inquired of S. concerning this arrangement, he became quite sharp with me, more angry than I have seen him in years of marriage. He instructed me to concern myself with household management and needlework, not with architectural decisions or security measures that were none of my concern. His hands trembled as he spoke. The entries continued in this vein throughout January, describing increasing tension within the household, unusual sounds that occurred with disturbing regularity, and a growing sense of isolation despite the presence of multiple persons on the estate. On January 16th, Parthenia noted, "We have not attended church for 3 consecutive Sundays. S. claims the roads remain impassable, yet I observed from the upper window that tracks of wagon wheels are clearly visible on the main road where it passes our property line. Other families are traveling. We are not snowbound by necessity. We are something else. I begin to feel as though we are being kept here, or perhaps keeping something here. January 22nd. An incident today that has left me much disturbed. While searching for additional candles in the still room, I discovered a wooden crate I had not seen before, partially concealed behind barrels of salt pork. The crate was of foreign make, with markings in what might be French or another continental language. It was empty, but lined with straw that held a peculiar odor, not of decay, but of something preserved beyond its natural duration. When I mentioned this to S. at dinner, he stood from the table so abruptly his chair fell backward. He demanded to know what I had been doing in that part of the house and ordered me never to enter the still room again without his express permission. This is his own home, yet he patrols it as though guarding a military position. The boys said nothing, but exchanged glances I could not interpret. January 27th. No post has been delivered for 3 weeks. S. claims the roads remain impassable, yet I observed from the upper window that tracks of wagon wheels are visible on the main road, and yesterday I saw our neighbor Coulter driving his cart toward town without apparent difficulty. This morning I attempted to send one of the servants to the post office with letters I had written to Sophronia and to my sister in Petersburg. S. intercepted the girl before she could leave and dismissed her from service on the spot, claiming insubordination, though the poor creature had done nothing but accept an errand from her mistress. We are not snowbound. We are being kept isolated, though I cannot fathom the purpose. January 30th. I ventured to S. study this evening, finding the door ajar, though he was not within. Upon his desk I saw papers that appeared to be correspondence, though the hand was unfamiliar to me. I should not have read them, but fear has overcome my respect for his privacy. The letters made reference to the acquisition and preparations completed according to instruction, and awaiting the optimal configuration, though I could not determine what these phrases meant. One phrase remains fixed in my mind. Once the alignment is achieved, the transfer may proceed, but all participants must maintain their commitment regardless of personal cost. The letter was unsigned and undated. When I heard S.'s footsteps in the hall, I withdrew quickly. My hand shook for an hour afterward. The entries from early February describe an escalation of whatever situation was developing. The sounds from the cellar increased in frequency and volume. Parthenia recorded that all members of the household were sleeping poorly, that servants were requesting release from service despite the middle of winter being an unusual time to change positions, and that both Devereux and Gideon had taken to carrying lanterns even during daylight hours when moving through certain parts of the house. February 6th. A terrible scene today. Young G appeared at breakfast with his hands wrapped in cloth. When I inquired about an injury, S. answered before the boy could speak, stating it was merely a burn from careless handling of a lamp. But I saw G. his face as this explanation was offered, and it was not the expression of someone corroborating a simple truth, it was fear. Later, when S. and D. had gone out to inspect the tobacco barns, I encountered G. in the hallway and asked him directly what had happened. He unwrapped the cloth enough for me to see. The injuries were not burns. They were regular marks, like scoring, as though his palms had been pressed against something with a textured surface sharp enough to break the skin in parallel lines. He said only, "We are in something beyond our capacity to control, and Father will not acknowledge it." Then he walked away before I could question him further. February 8th. I can no longer remain passive in the face of what is occurring in this house. This morning, I rose before dawn and made my way to the external cellar entrance while the men were still abed. The door was secured with 3 substantial locks, as D. had mentioned. But what he had not mentioned, or perhaps had not known, was that the door itself showed signs of disturbance from the inside. The wood around the locks was splintered, not as though someone had attempted to break in, but as though something had pressed outward with considerable force. Fresh gouges in the wood suggested this pressure was recent, perhaps from the previous night. I pressed my ear to the door and heard what I cannot describe as anything other than breathing, deep, slow, and far too resonant to be produced by any animal I know. As I stood there, the breathing stopped. In the silence that followed, I became convinced that whatever was below had become aware of my presence above. I retreated to the house and have spent the day unable to dispel the sensation of being observed. February 11th, the final entry in the ledger, is barely legible. Each letter formed with evident difficulty. They have taken the key. All three of them, S and both boys, went down at dusk and have not returned. I called to them through the door, first requesting, then demanding they answer me. There is no response to my voice. Only those sounds, louder now, like furniture being moved across a stone floor, though we keep no furniture in that space. But there is something else beneath that sound, something that might be voices, but speaking in unison, in a manner that human speech should not achieve. S. sits in his study now, though I know he went down to the cellar. He sits in his study and will not speak. He stares at the wall and his lips move, but no sound emerges. His eyes do not blink. I touched his hand and it was cold as stone. I am the only one who will write what I have seen. When I looked through the window of the study door, S. sat at his desk, but in the reflection on the glass, the chair was empty. Here the entry breaks off mid-sentence. The remainder of the page is blank, and the following pages have been torn out, leaving only ragged edges in the binding. Examination of the ledger showed that approximately 20 pages had been removed, likely at the time the book was concealed. This ledger was examined by the historian Lavinia Pritchard, who had discovered Merrick's testimony. In her 1964 paper for the Virginia Historical Quarterly, Pritchard attempted to correlate the ledger entries with other surviving documents from the period. She noted that the county death register, in its reconstituted form, recorded the deaths of Devereux and Gideon Caldwell in March 1801, both attributed to winter fever, complications thereof. The entries were dated March 15th and March 17th, respectively, with burial recorded at the family plot on the estate grounds. However, the attending physician listed on these death certificates was a Dr. Morton Threlkeld of Charlottesville. Pritchard could find no other record of this physician in Virginia medical registers of the period. No license application, no property ownership, no tax records, no church membership, no mention in any other document she examined. It was as though Dr. Morton Threlkeld had existed only long enough to sign 2 death certificates, then vanished from all documentation. More intriguing was what Pritchard discovered about Silas Caldwell himself through examination of courthouse records. In April 1801, he appeared at the county courthouse and executed a comprehensive transfer of power of attorney to his son-in-law, Horace Wycliffe, in Richmond, citing his own infirmity of mind and body as reason for relinquishing direct management of the estate. Witnesses to this document noted that Caldwell signed with great difficulty, his signature barely recognizable compared to earlier examples in the record books, and that he appeared much aged beyond his years, with hair gone entirely white and hands that trembled without ceasing. One witness, a clerk named Pemberton, added an unofficial notation that Caldwell spoke not a word during the proceeding, and when addressed directly, seemed not to comprehend the questions posed to him. Silas Caldwell was admitted to a private asylum outside of Williamsburg in June 1801 and died there in November of the same year. The asylum's records, preserved in fragmentary form in the archives of the medical college that later occupied the building, indicate that he was generally docile and unresponsive, requiring assistance with all basic functions of living. He suffered from periodic episodes of extreme agitation, particularly during nighttime hours, during which he had to be confined for his own safety. An attendance note from October 1801 states, "Patient S.C. woke the ward shortly after midnight with cries that they are still below," and the promises were false. Wakesyke required physical restraint and administration of laudanum to restore calm. Upon quieting, he wept and repeated the phrase, "We should not have opened it," but could not or would not explain what it referred to. Most peculiar was his insistence that he could hear voices calling to him from beneath the floor, though our facility is constructed on a solid foundation with no cellar or sublevel. His agitation increased when we attempted to convince him of this fact, and he became violent, requiring isolation until the following morning. Another note from the asylum's physician, dated October 15, 1801, S.C. remains in a state of profound disturbance. He has carved marks into the wall of his room using his fingernails, creating a pattern of lines that repeat across the entire surface within his reach. When asked to explain these marks, he states they are the sequence, but will not elaborate. Most concerning is his claim that he can still feel them moving through him, and that the transfer was not complete. I suspect his condition may be attributable to extended exposure to some environmental toxin on his property, possibly ergot in grain storage or carbon monoxide from improperly ventilated heating sources, which could explain both the mental deterioration and his specific delusions about invisible entities. Parthenia Caldwell disappeared from official records after April 1801. There is no death certificate, no will, no property transfer, no mention in any subsequent documentation. The last documented mention of her is in a letter dated March 23, 1801, written by a neighbor, one Abigail Fenmore, to a friend in Maryland. Fenmore wrote, "Called upon Mrs. C. yesterday, as I had not seen her at church for many weeks, and wished to assure myself of her welfare. Was received at the door with such coldness and formality as to astonish me, for we had previously enjoyed cordial relations. She appeared in reasonable health, though much thinner than when last I saw her, and with a peculiar rigidity to her posture, as though maintaining her verticality required constant effort. She would not invite me beyond the entrance hall, which I found quite strange, given the cold weather. I noted the house had a peculiar odor, not of uncleanliness, but of damp earth, though the weather has been dry for a week past, and there should be no moisture in a well-maintained house. Most singular was her response when I inquired after her stepsons, whom I had not seen for some time. She smiled in a manner quite unlike her usual aspect, too broad, too fixed, and said only, 'They have found their place and are content in it.' When I asked what she meant by this cryptic statement, she closed the door, and I heard the bolt slide into place. I stood there a moment, quite taken aback, and heard through the door what sounded like weeping, or perhaps laughter. It was difficult to distinguish which. I have not returned, and do not intend to." Several weeks after this encounter, Fenmore mentioned in another letter that the Caldwell house appeared to be vacant. No smoke from chimneys, no movement observed, no response to callers. The servants have all departed, apparently without giving notice. Local speculation suggests the family has removed to Richmond to be near the daughter, though no one has confirmed this directly. The new owners of the Caldwell property, who took possession in 1842, after Horace Wycliffe finally sold the estate following 4 decades of neglect and non-occupation, reported unusual conditions throughout the structure, but particularly in the cellar. According to a deed filing that includes a detailed inspection report prepared for the purchasers, the cellar showed evidence of structural modifications that did not match the original construction and that could not be dated or attributed to any documented renovation. A portion of the eastern wall had been rebuilt using different mortar and bricks that did not match the rest of the space in either size or composition. The reconstruction appeared to have been done hastily, without proper finishing, leaving rough edges and uneven surfaces. Most peculiar was a notation that an attempt appears to have been made to brick up an opening or a doorway in this reconstructed section, but this work was never completed, leaving a cavity approximately 4 feet in height and 2 feet in width. The edges of this cavity show marks consistent with tools, but also what appear to be scratches or gouges made by some other means. The interior of the cavity extends back into darkness beyond the reach of our lamps, suggesting it may connect to some natural cave formation or may be an unfinished expansion of the cellar. We declined to explore further. The new owners, the Drummond family from Maryland, commissioned a thorough cleaning and assessment of the cellar before moving in. Workers removing accumulated debris and making necessary repairs found several items that were cataloged in the property transfer documents and later preserved as curiosities by the Drummond family. Rusted manacles of a type typically used for securing livestock during transport, a broken oil lamp of foreign manufacture, several pieces of chalk or white stone used for writing on floors, and what was described as an assemblage of small bones, possibly animal in origin, arranged in a geometric pattern within a circle of ash. The bones appeared to have been placed with deliberate precision, and the ash showed no signs of disturbance, despite the passage of many years since the house was last occupied. These items were mentioned in greater detail in a letter written by Mrs. Lydia Drummond to her sister in Baltimore in 1843, shortly before the fire that would destroy the house. Mrs. Drummond wrote, "The cellar here unsettles me greatly. The cleaning has been done most thoroughly, the walls have been whitewashed, new stairs have been installed, and we have placed proper storage shelving throughout. Yet there persists an atmosphere of wrongness I cannot rationally explain. Items left in that space overnight are found rearranged by morning. We assume rats, though no droppings or gnaw marks suggest their presence, and traps we have set remain unsprung. More disturbing are the sounds that rise through the floorboards on certain nights. Not the expected settling of an old house, which I am familiar with from our previous home, but a rhythmic sound, as of something heavy being dragged across stone back and forth, without pause or variation, continuing sometimes for hours. The servants refuse to remain in the house after sundown. Several have given notice despite favorable wages and conditions. They speak among themselves about old business not properly concluded and things that were started but not finished. I begin to understand why this property stood vacant for so many years despite its considerable value." Mrs. Drummond's letter continued, "Most disturbing of all was an incident 3 nights ago. My husband descended to the cellar to investigate the sounds we had been hearing. I stood at the top of the stairs with a lamp, calling down to him as he went. He reached the bottom and began to examine the far wall, where that peculiar cavity exists that we have been meaning to properly seal. As he drew near it, his lamp seemed to dim, though there was no draught that should have affected the flame. He called up to me that there was a cold spot, quite pronounced, as though winter air were flowing from within the wall. Then he went quiet. I called to him repeatedly, growing alarmed. After what seemed an eternity, but was likely only a minute or two, he emerged back up the stairs, moving quickly, his face quite pale. He would not speak of what he had experienced, saying only that we must seal that cavity immediately and completely, and that we must do so with brick, mortar, and iron in that specific combination. When I pressed him for explanation, he said only, "There are spaces in this world that should not be opened, and this is one of them. Something was begun here that was never properly ended, and I will not be the one to continue it." The Drummonds vacated the property 2 months before the fire, returning to Maryland and abandoning their considerable investment in the property. In a final letter to her sister, dated June 1843, Lydia Drummond wrote, "We have left the Caldwell place and will not return. The house stands empty now, and may it remain so. What we experienced there in our final weeks exceeded my capacity to describe in rational terms. Sufficient to say that some locations retain echoes of events that transpired within them, and these echoes grow louder rather than fading with time. We heard voices in that cellar speaking words in no language I recognized. We found marks on walls that we had observed to be unmarked the previous day. Objects moved not merely from place to place, but appeared and disappeared. And on our final night there, my husband swore he saw figures descending the cellar stairs, 3 of them each carrying a lamp, though when he followed, he found the cellar empty and the external door still locked from outside. We departed the following morning and sent men to collect our belongings, which they did with great reluctance and only during full daylight. The house stood empty for 3 weeks before it burned. No investigation was conducted, as the property was vacant and the loss affected no occupied dwelling. The ruins were left untouched for several years before the land was sold again. In her 1964 paper, Lavinia Pritchard compiled these various fragments and offered a tentative reconstruction of events. She proposed that something occurred in the Caldwell household during the winter of 1800-1801 that resulted in the deaths of at least 2 family members under circumstances that were subsequently concealed through deliberate alteration of official records. She speculated that Silas Caldwell's mental breakdown and his cryptic statements about opening something suggested an incident in the cellar, possibly involving the discovery of a sealed space or the conducting of some activity within that space. Pritchard noted that the Caldwell estate's location and the time period coincided with persistent but poorly documented rumors about certain Virginia families engaging in practices that fell outside accepted religious and social norms. She cited, but did not elaborate on, references in personal correspondence from the period to philosophical societies and experimental lodges that allegedly met in isolated locations to pursue what participants described as investigations into hidden knowledge, or practical experiments in natural philosophy beyond the accepted curriculum. There existed during this period various groups interested in what they termed natural magic or empirical mysticism, attempting to apply rational experimental methods to phenomena that fell outside conventional science. Some of these groups maintained correspondence with similar organizations in Europe, particularly in France and Germany, where such pursuits enjoyed brief periods of intellectual respectability before being suppressed. Whether the Caldwell family was connected to any such group, and whether this connection bore any relation to the events of that winter, Pritchard could not definitively establish. She concluded her paper by noting that the deliberate alteration of public records indicated conscious and coordinated effort by multiple persons of standing to obscure events that they deemed necessary to erase from collective memory. The question is not whether something occurred that required concealment, but what that something was, and why persons who were pillars of their community would participate in falsifying official records. Pritchard's own research ended abruptly in 1965. According to university records, she requested and was granted a sabbatical, during which she informed colleagues she intended to continue investigating certain aspects of the Caldwell case. She had mentioned to her department chair that she had identified the location of additional documents held by descendants of families mentioned in the case, and that she had arranged to visit a private archive in Virginia to examine these materials. She never returned to her position. Attempts by the university to contact her were unsuccessful. Her apartment was found vacant, with most of her research materials missing. The landlord reported that the apartment had been left in good order, with rent paid through the end of the month, but that all filing cabinets and boxes of documents had been removed. A brief note left with the building superintendent stated only that she had decided to pursue other interests, and provided no forwarding address or contact information. A colleague who had worked closely with Pritchard, Professor Malcolm Hendricks, made inquiries into her whereabouts and eventually reported to the department that her bank account had been closed, her post office box canceled, and her vehicle registration transferred to an address in Pennsylvania that, when investigated, proved to be non-existent. All traces of Lavinia Pritchard simply ended in the spring of 1965. The site of the Caldwell estate is now part of a working farm, the land having changed hands multiple times since the 1840s. The cellar was completely filled with stone rubble and graded over in 1955 during agricultural improvements to the property. The foundation stones were removed and repurposed for other construction. The current owners, who purchased the land in 1988, were unaware of its history until contacted by a local historical society in 1992 following the rediscovery of some of Pritchard's preliminary research notes in a university archive. When interviewed by the Historical Society, the current landowner, Robert Callahan, mentioned that certain areas of the property had always given him an uneasy feeling, particularly the slight rise where the original house had stood. "Nothing grows quite right there," he stated. "The soil is good, same composition as the surrounding fields, but we've had repeated crop failures in that specific location. Whatever we plant there either doesn't germinate or grows stunted and dies before harvest. We've had the soil tested multiple times, no contamination, no unusual mineral content, nothing that would explain it. We finally just left it fallow and work around it." What actually happened at Caldwell Heights during that winter remains, in the language of historical investigation, undetermined pending discovery of additional evidence. The gaps in the record, the altered documents, and the fragmentary testimonies suggest concealment but do not specify what was concealed. The mental deterioration of Silas Caldwell, the disappearance of his wife, the deaths of his sons, and the persistent reports of unusual phenomena at the location might indicate personal tragedy, criminal activity, environmental factors affecting mental health, or the psychological aftermath of events that exceeded the participants' ability to process or articulate within the conceptual frameworks available to them. The county clerk, Hosea Whitfield, who first noted the irregularities in the records, added one final observation in his marginal notation, written in smaller script as though he wished to minimize its prominence. "Have spoken with two elderly persons who resided in that district in 1801, both now past their 80th year. Both recalled the Caldwell estate being, in their words, a place people learned not to visit after dark. When pressed for specifics, both declined to elaborate, with one stating only, 'Some silences are maintained for good reason, and this is one of them.' The other would say only, 'What was done there could not be undone, and what was begun could not be completed, and the consequence is something that persists beyond the lives of those who started it. Best leave it alone.'" In 1966, the year after Lavinia Pritchard's disappearance, her research assistant, a graduate student named Marcus Webb, published a brief note in a regional history journal. Webb stated that among Pritchard's papers he had reviewed before her departure was a personal journal in which she recorded her evolving thoughts about the Caldwell case. According to Webb, one of the final entries in this journal read, "Have become convinced that the official silence surrounding these events was not merely to protect reputation, but to prevent replication. The pattern of activity suggested by the fragmentary evidence points to deliberate action, not accident or natural event, but deliberate action toward what end? The geometrically arranged items found in the cellar, the modifications to the structure creating a cavity that extends beyond the foundation, the timing of events corresponding to specific astronomical configurations I have calculated from period almanacs, the references and correspondence to preparations and alignments, all suggest systematic preparation for something specific. The question that now dominates my thoughts is not what happened, but what was intended to happen and whether it was successful, partially successful, or incomplete. Each possibility carries different implications." Webb quoted another passage from Pritchard's journal. The most disturbing aspect is the evidence of continuation. The phenomena reported by subsequent occupants of the property, occurring over decades, suggest that whatever was initiated was not concluded by the deaths of the participants. If Silas Caldwell's statements in the asylum are interpreted literally rather than as symptoms of derangement, the transfer was not complete. They are still below. Then perhaps what occurred was an attempt at something that began but did not finish, leaving a process suspended, incomplete, persisting in that suspended state. I have found references in documents from the 1790s acquired by University Library to a theory then circulating in certain circles that consciousness might be transferred or preserved through specific procedures involving geometric patterns, material correspondences, and what was termed sacrificial anchor. Whether the Caldwells had access to such theories, I cannot yet prove, but the circumstantial evidence is suggestive. This journal, like most of Pritchard's research materials, has not been located. Webb reported that he made copies of several pages before Pritchard's departure, but these copies vanished from his own files during a burglary of his apartment in 1967. Nothing else was taken in this burglary, not the television, not cash left visible on a desk, not any other valuable items. Only the folder containing the copied journal pages was removed. Records show no further academic investigation of the Caldwell case after 1966. The fragmentary evidence remains cataloged in various archives: the altered county records in the Virginia State Library, the household ledger in the Historical Society collection in Charlottesville, the testimonies buried in court documents, the letters preserved by historical accident in family papers donated to libraries. Each piece suggests something occurred, but collectively they resist assembling into a coherent narrative that explains what that something was. The Caldwell family line continued through Sophronia's descendants in Richmond, none of whom maintained any connection to the Albemarle County property or, apparently, any knowledge of the events of 1801. The name Caldwell appears with normal frequency in Virginia records throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, associated with various occupations and locations, bearing no particular distinction or notoriety. If any family records or oral traditions preserved information about what occurred at Caldwell Heights, they were not transmitted beyond 1 or 2 generations. The land where the estate once stood produces corn and soybeans in rotation. The foundation stones were removed decades ago. No marker indicates that anything unusual ever occurred at that location. The historical record, such as it is, resides in scattered documents that must be deliberately sought out to be found, in archives that require specific knowledge of their existence and location. For most practical purposes, the Caldwell case has achieved what appears to have been the original intention of those who altered the records: complete erasure from collective memory. Whether this erasure serves the interests of historical truth or serves some other purpose remains a question without consensus answer. Some events resist explanation not because evidence is lacking, but because the available evidence points in directions that challenge conventional understanding of what is possible or permissible to acknowledge. The winter of 1800-1801 at Caldwell Heights may represent one such event, documented enough to confirm something happened, but obscured enough that what happened remains, and perhaps was always intended to remain, beyond definitive determination. The silences in the historical record are as informative as the fragments that survive. They tell us that people with authority and social standing made conscious decisions about what would be remembered and what would be forgotten. They tell us that certain events were considered too disturbing or too dangerous to preserve in official memory. They tell us that sometimes the absence of information is itself a form of information. What remains is a pattern of effects without clear cause, of consequences without recorded origin, of persistent phenomena attached to a specific location across generations of occupancy. Whether these effects have natural explanations that were simply beyond the capacity of 19th century observers to articulate, or whether they point to something that exceeds our current frameworks for understanding human experience and physical reality, is a question that may never be resolved to everyone's satisfaction. The case of Caldwell Heights stands as a reminder that history is not merely what happened, but what was recorded about what happened, and that the silences and gaps in the record may be as significant as the words that were allowed to remain.